Okay, so next up we have another returning presenter, and I'm so pleased to welcome back Dr. Andy Clegg from the University of Portsmouth. Andy talked a while ago about motorway analogies, and it was a really, really popular talk. So no pressure, Andy. You need to follow that one up again.
Can you hear me all right, Bill?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. It's great to be back. Thank you, everybody. I don't know how you follow Sean's one because I'm going to have to go back to old school and I'm just here. So nothing has flashed, I'm afraid. So what I'd like to talk to you about this afternoon is the outcomes of a project that I have supported with law colleagues at the University of Portsmouth, an advanced HE and assessment and feedback project. And it has implications for learning design around assessment, whether it's face-to-face, asynchronous, synchronous, digital. And what I'd like to do today is take you through that process, because I think it's where the transferability of the process has the kind of like can impact other disciplines as well. So I'm going to talk you through the process. I'm going to show you how we captured the student voice. I'm going to show you how that linked to some simple guiding principles that evolved to help project thinking, and then just highlight some key outcomes from the project itself. So a little bit of context. This I worked with law colleagues at Portsmouth. This is in an advanced HE and assessment of feedback law publication that is now available from Advanced HE. So please take the opportunity to find that document and read in more detail the chapter that my colleagues wrote. Just to give you a bit of a context, law in Portsmouth is very similar to other areas. That assessment and feedback has been a constant challenge, with students worried about consistency between marking, the fairness, and so on. And NSS results showed that while close to the sector average, we were slightly lower than the university average. 70% of students found the assessment and feedback were fair, 75% students found their feedback was helpful, but the general feedback was there was a need for some level of enhancement. There were also clear issues with progression at the end of the year, particularly between the first and second years of study. And the other major issue was that students really struggled to feel part of a community, found it very difficult to find time for personal and career development. And that erosion of the community was particularly felt during COVID and the transition to online delivery. The other influencing power for law colleagues was the external influences on what they do, particularly around assessment and preparing students for that career in law. And here the solicitor's qualifying exam that's being introduced for undergraduate studies from this autumn, and the implications that actually has around assessment design. So what did we do? Well, in the context of the project aims was to really think about ways to enhance the student experience and to develop a new assessment strategy and some supporting resources to go with that. So what we did, and this is the transferability of the process, we started off by running a series of focus groups with level 5 and level 6 students. Now, I've done this before. I was based at Chichester before coming to Portsmouth, and I've used this approach there, and it works really well. And what we did in the focus groups was targeted the discussion around key NSS questions to help us really understand how they were seeing and interpreting NSS questions. So the first one we looked at was marking has been fair, consistent. So what we tried to get from the focus group is, what does this actually mean to you? What does fair mean in reality? Could they give us examples of where assessment has been fair or not, in their opinion? And also to use the focus group as an opportunity for co-creation to get ideas of what the students think needed to be changed and the kind of interventions that they would actually introduce to enhance elements of the experience. Now, I'll just share with you some of the kind of like voices that came back from that. I'm not going to read them, but you can see that they are typical kind of qualitative comments that you would find in the NSS. But if you then start drilling that down a little bit, you begin to see the kind of headline comments that are coming out. Dialogic approach, the need for continuity, clarity, communication, the importance of feed forward, and so on and so forth. So we started by doing a bit of content analysis and taking these key thematic narratives around out. For theme 2, we asked about, I have received helpful comments on my work. And again, this notion of, okay, what does helpful actually mean to you? Can you please give us examples of where comments have been helpful or unhelpful? And again, what needs to change? What kind of interventions would you as a student put in place? So again, the kind of comments that we get back were quite telling. And you've probably seen comments like this yourselves before. But if we start drilling down and then just highlighting some of the key ones, you begin to see a story of, I think the one that was particularly telling when I really started talking to the students was, I'm terrified every time a grade is released. The apprehension about getting lots of feedback at one point in time, the lack of clarity around why did I get a 60%? Where's the rest of those marks gone? And perhaps the clumping of assessment opportunities in one spot rather than actually spreading them through the course of the module and linking that to a slightly more discernible focus around formative assessment. So if you can see, a lot of these feedback begins with C. So to help the thinking, what we evolved from that was some simple guiding principles to do this. So we went for the 5. So let me just quickly run you through these. So the primary principle that seemed to come out was the need for greater clarity, and greater clarity in the different stages of the assessment process. So we started thinking about the nature of the instructions, the guidance, the assessment criteria, but during the nature of the formative assessment, the use of exemplars that we can actually give to the students, but also afterwards, the clarity around feedback, the kind of terminology that we use, the language that we use in feedback to not disenfranchise students further, but also the nature of the feed forward that was there as well. And that evolved, if you like, into the creation of a student assessment handbook we've talked about, and they are going to develop an interactive glossary of terminology that we use. But also these discussions allowed staff to start talking about the way that they were giving video feedback in some of the modules, and we're beginning to play with that, and also the use of Panopto. But also getting colleagues to think about consistency in the wider assessment and feedback cycle was really important. And that was something that the students pulled up quite a lot, that they just felt, actually, we're not sure because we get one message from one member of staff and we get another message from somebody else. So this consistency was really critical to the overall process, but also generating conversations amongst the team. What became really immediate is that people were operating in silos. Those team-based discussions weren't there. So as part of this process, we really got the team starting to communicate with each other a bit more about their shared values, building in and working around standardization and collaboration activities, peer observations around assessment and feedback, but also, as you can tell from the nature of the focus groups, actually getting those students involved in the assessment design process from the start. And just the intervention itself was very, very powerful in changing the perception of students about how their voice was heard. Also about communications to students, not just the nature of the feedback, but literal things like when work is released. Why are we releasing work on a Friday afternoon when there's no staff around to talk about it? So a lot of thought about what is the best time of the week to release feedback. What time of day is the best time to release feedback? Do we release all their feedback in one go, or do we try and do little bits so they have time to take some in and absorb it? When I was at Chi, I was always aware that when we offloaded a lot of feedback at one time, the students mentally found it very, very challenging, particularly for those weaker students that just found the very nature of lots of things to take on board incredibly overwhelming, and they would often just switch off and not really take and think about the nature of the feedback that had been provided and how to respond positively with it. And of course, if you start working around those kind of principles, the other thing that we've tried to do, and it is we seem to be having some success, is just creating this community with staff and students around assessment and feedback literacy, but creating a culture where there are clear expectations and narratives around assessment and feedback, creative approaches to assessment and feedback that kind of like pick up the 5 C's. So we use this as a bit of a starting point at some team meetings. And of course, you can imagine that those team meetings were quite challenging in some ways, because certain colleagues found it quite challenging to engage in the process. But through that collective and collaborative approach, you can see we put the emphasis on the C's. We really started to change the culture. Now, the outcome of this, let me just highlight some of the key outcomes, is that the law colleagues went away and they worked around an assessment and feedback strategy. And on the basis of the 5 C's, they come up with their own key areas. So focus on the use of terminology, particularly in law, the focus on feed forward, consistency and collaboration, and to balance individual feedback with group feedback, and perhaps using technology to offer individual feedback, but using video and audio to perhaps highlight more generic issues or reflections around work as it's come in that can be provided to the students quite quickly before the individual feedback comes back in turn. The assessment and feedback strategy, some specifics in there, reducing the assessment burden so the students aren't over-assessed, looking at additional opportunities for formative assessment. With the new SQE requirement, introducing and focusing innovative ways to introduce multiple choice questions, using something like, I can't remember it, to create, oh, my brain's gone mad, Janali to create an interactive glossary for terminology, electronic feedback portfolios, we're looking at where we can capture and reflect on feedback, but underpinned by this constant cycle of reflection. But what we have achieved is this team-based approach to assessment design. And I'll come back and do this one, Phil, but we've at Portsmouth, we have this new learning design concept called Enable. And again, I'll put the web address. Please go and look at our Enable resources. But we have taken the law team into Enable, and that has further facilitated the emphasis on a team-based approach to kind of like learning design and assessment, which is having a significant impact. In terms of impact, the external examiners this year noted improvements in feed forward. The NSS results also seem to suggest we are heading in the right direction. So it'd be interesting to see what the 2022 results will look like, and we haven't got long to wait for those. But I think I'd just finish by the key takeaways from this is the power of the intervention itself. The project, the fact that I went in as a third-party observer in a focus group, gave the students the confidence that their concerns around assessment and feedback had been addressed, and they could talk quite confidently in a safe space about their concerns, but could also share really innovative ideas for enhancement that we've been able to take on board and embed into the project. And that's seen in some of the outcomes that are actually coming. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you so much, Andy. Another fantastic talk, and I've shared the link to your Enable page as well. We have got 2 minutes left, so we've got time for one question, and I'm going to ask the question that Stefano has put in the chat. Sorry, Stefano, given the time, I thought I would just ask it on your behalf. I hope that's okay. Stefano has asked a great question, and that's: how do you assess the clarity of your instructions and assessment criteria? And do students contribute their opinion?
That's something we're working on. But just to give you some examples of what do we mean by enhancing clarity, very quick example. They were doing a lot of work around rubrics, and you provide students with the rubrics around what does it mean to get a 40, 50, 60. And I think the intervention that I provided based on work at Chichester was, why are we giving very detailed rubrics that for students create an awful lot of noise? I don't want to give them guidance on how to get a 40. I want to give them guidance on how to get a first. And so this comes from something that we did at Chichester, was in the handbooks, we put a lot of attention on, these are the characteristics of a first. This is the kind of things that you should be focusing on to get to that top level. And we actually moved the fuller rubric away. Now, when the students got the feedback, they then were given the full rubric so they could see how their mark aligned to the assessment criteria. But the transferability of that and the feedback from the students was, getting rid of that noise helps us really understand the kind of level that you want us to get to in this piece of work if we're aiming for a first. So the assessment to that is actually collectively as a team sharing the values around what does a really good piece of work look like for a first, and let's try and focus our narrative around that, but make sure that we all have that same shared understanding when we're actually giving the feedback, and recognizing that if somebody got 45%, the quality of the feedback they get should be equal to the quality of feedback that somebody perhaps got 80% on that scale.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. It's so important that the consistency of feedback is consistent across the board. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, Andy, today. I'm so sorry. I do hate doing this, but we do have to kind of stick to a schedule.
That's fine.
Thank you so much. It was another great talk, and we'd love to have you back again in the future as well. You always do such good talks.